This evening's reading is from Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32. That's Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32. And he said, "There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him.' And he said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'"
Good evening, my name's Sam. Welcome to this Guest Sunday online. It's great you've been able to join us. I'm on the staff team here. Mickey was preaching for us this morning, wasn't he, on one of the questions, true love, what does it look like? And we're thinking this evening about true love, who is it for? I want you to imagine for a second 2 different groups of people. One group contains the morally upright in society, the successful ones, the ones for whom everything's turned out okay. Perhaps they're very religious, the sort who button up their top button for Sunday church and say very long prayers that every Christian would find impressive, and could very quickly tell you all the things they've done for God that week. The other group contains those who have, well, they've fallen down in life, really. The ones who are all too aware of the skeletons in their closet, the ones who would admit doing terrible things, the ones we'd find uncomfortable to have over for dinner. Maybe you can think of some of those people who they be now that might not get your invite as easily back home for a meal. Perhaps the fraudster who's locked up in prison, the prostitute who feels shame, the husband who knew he tore his family apart. Here's the question: if God came down to earth, who would he be most likely to hang out with? Who would we expect him to show love to? I start that way because it's the exact scenario we have at the beginning of this evening's passage. We're looking at Luke chapter 15 this evening. We just had it read to us. Do open it up. If you haven't got a Bible, you might have a Bible, open it up to Luke chapter 15. Matthew, Mark, Luke, third gospel writer in the New Testament. Or if you've got surfing on the internet right now, open up a tab, Bible Gateway, type in Bible Gateway to Google and then find Luke chapter 15. If you've got an app on your phone, scroll down to it, Luke chapter 15. As you're doing all those different things, all those different ways of finding it, it's worth mentioning that Luke was a doctor. This guy who wrote this gospel account of Jesus' life, he was a learned man. He'd meticulously gathered evidence and done all of his research with eyewitnesses to give us what we have in front of us. And tonight we're looking at a particular moment in history that really happened and came out of that research. And it's a scenario where Jesus, the one who claimed to be God come down, is surrounded by two groups of people. The two groups that I actually kind of introduced to us there a moment ago. Luke chapter 15 verse 1, let me read it to you. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to hear Jesus." The tax collectors and sinners, they were the ones with the moral failures very evident to all. Tax collectors would have been seen as fraudsters in that culture, dishonest cheats. Sinners, well, those would have been the people that everyone could see just clearly had disobeyed God's laws. The second type of people I spoke about a minute ago, the outcasts of society. Maybe even prostitutes. Often in the Gospels where it talks about tax collectors, it says, and sometimes sinners, sometimes prostitutes that Jesus would hang around with. And then you've got the first group who are mentioned in the next verse, the Pharisees and the scribes. The Pharisees and the scribes, well, they were the religious prim and proper folk. As I say, the first group that I mentioned, and they would have been teachers of God's law who kind of went around showing everything that they'd been doing for God. And the thing is that those guys, the religious prim and proper folk, they are grumbling in verse 2. They're saying, Jesus, this man receives sinners and eats with them. Perhaps you can understand the shock. Jesus, what's going on here? You're saying you're God's king, but look at the sort of people you are hanging out with, the sort of people we wouldn't be seen dead with, Jesus. You're an embarrassment. Your public campaign for being something special is going down the drain. If God turned up today, surely the places he would avoid would be the prisons and the brothels and the homeless shelters and, well, we'd say other things as well, potentially. And maybe we can agree with that grumbling. It is a shock, isn't it, to think that Jesus is hanging out with these sorts of people. And in that context, Jesus, he tells a trilogy of stories. And it's a trilogy about love, about God's love, a true love trilogy, you might say. We've just had the last story from the trilogy read, which is the longest of the lot, and it picks up on a big theme that Jesus tees up in the two shorter stories as well. And it's something he's wanting to teach these Pharisees and scribes who are grumbling because Jesus is hanging out with dishonest tax collectors and sinners. And that big idea is that God loves to save sinners, those who are lost, those who have stuffed up. God's love isn't something that's to be earned. It's something he shows to people who don't deserve it. And that's the big point in the third story too, the longest in this trilogy. And we're going to look at it together in more detail now. And I'm going to give you the answer. I did it a minute ago, but I'm going to give you the answer to our question this evening up front. And then we'll look at the story. Who is true love for? Who is true love for? Well, true love is for those who don't deserve it. Or in the words of Jesus' story, true love is for rebels who've run away. Have you ever wished someone was dead? I'll chill out a little bit, okay? I'll chill out. How about this for a question? Have you ever said, well, it would be better right now in my life if X wasn't around, if that person wasn't around? That's how the third story in the True Love trilogy begins. It begins with a father and two sons. And at the beginning of the story, the younger son wishes his father was dead. Just look at verse 11. And Jesus is telling this story, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Now you might say, what is the big deal with that question? But what's going on is the younger son wants his inheritance money now. Money that he should be getting once his father's gone, once his father's dead, but he wants it now. Can you see what he's saying? Can you see the thought behind his question? He's basically saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. I want the money that's due to me when you die now. And he's going to use it, as we see in a minute, to run as far away from his father as possible. It may be that your dad is planning to leave you some inheritance money when they die. Can you imagine how they would feel if you went up to them and said, yeah, you know that money that's due to me in your will? Give it to me now. Give it to me today. I want it. I don't want you. I want the money. And I'm going to leave you. Verse 13, just look what happens. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. Give me the inheritance money, Dad, and I'm going to go and squander it over here. Can you imagine how the father would feel? The son wants his dad dead. It's a shocking start to the story. It would have been even more shocking, I think, in that culture. But actually, Jesus' story is even more shocking than we might first think still. Because it's this story because in this story, the son represents humanity and the father represents God. So let me rephrase the question that I began with. Have you ever wished that God was dead? Have you ever thought, you know what, life would be better off right now, God, if you weren't around? We all have, haven't we? That is actually the default state that we're in as humans. That's humanity's story. By the way, I know what you're thinking. As I say this, lots of you may be thinking, hang on a second, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God, or I'm an agnostic. I'm not entirely sure. I just want to be a little bit controversial here and say something right up front that the Bible is very happy to say about you. The Bible assumes that we as humans, we do know that there is a God, but we've run away from him. Isn't that interesting? The previous two stories in the True Love trilogy that Jesus tells are all about someone searching for what is lost. And the point in those stories is that we are the thing that is lost, and God is the one who goes and finds. We're the lost sheep. God is the shepherd who goes and finds. It's not the other way around. It's not that God is hiding and he's hard to find, and it's his fault that he's not being clear about his existence. Instead, humans want to hide from God, who he knows there in the first place. I'm happy to chat more about that afterwards in question time. I know I'm aware that's a little bit controversial, but it's worth knowing that as we continue to understand the rest of this story. The Bible never says that humans are desperately seeking to try and find a God who's unclear and doesn't really want to be known. It flips it round the other way. It says we are all rebels who've run away. We do know that there is a God, but we just don't want to be under his rule. We know the Father is there. We just think life would be better off without him. We want to be in charge. We want to be our own gods. We want to say, I want to be boss. I'm the boss of me. And we want, like the son in this story, we want the real boss dead. So now we've cast ourselves into the story, perhaps slightly controversially. Let's see how things are working out for this son, for this rebel who's run away. Well, life without his father, it starts to go very wrong indeed. The son thinks he's got the good life planned, but actually things end up much worse than he'd ever imagined. Rejecting his father's loving rule ends in a very bad place. The good life he'd thought he could get ends up being horrible. He was hoping to achieve the highs without his father, and all he gets are the morning after moments. Look at verse 13 again. I'll read from verse 13 again. Not many days later, the young son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he'd spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. The child who ran away from his good, loving father ends up in a complete mess. The rebel who ran away didn't get what was advertised, did he? And by the way, that is true for any of us tonight who think it's a good idea to run away from God's loving rule. We never get what is advertised. But we're not going to dwell on that for now. We're going to look at what happens next to this son. The son comes to his senses, doesn't he? His surroundings force him to do just that. Living without his loving father ends in a very cold shower. And just look at verse 17. Look what happens next in the story. Verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hard servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father. The runaway has woken up. He's realised that he must return to his father. Here's the big question. How do you think his father will respond if he returns? What do you expect his father's response to his rebellious son's return to be? I don't think the son has very high hopes. We've put ourselves in his shoes. Let's just put ourselves in the shoes again of the father. The father has only ever loved this son, only ever looked after him, protected him, cared for and provided for him. Hundreds of nappies changed without any thank yous because he loves him. Always there as a source of wisdom, always there to comfort and help him in difficult moments, picks him up when he falls, appears at the sideline of every football match, cheering him on maybe. One day, his son turns to him and says, I want you dead. I don't want you, I want your money. And then the son uses the money, well, to shame his father, doesn't he? Spends it all on reckless living till he becomes the sort of person that people walk by and they shiver as they walk by. The sort of person we'd never invite round for a meal. Gorging on pig feed. The sort of person people are embarrassed about. The gossips and the whispers are generated far and wide in the land. Can you believe what that son's gone and done? Can you, how ashamed would you be if you were his father? I'm so glad that he is not my son. Back to my question. How do you expect this father to respond as his rebellious son returns? Well, as I said, I don't think we should get our hopes up. I mean, the son doesn't, does he? He realises that he's done wrong, and he realises that he needs to say sorry. So he kind of has this apology speech that he practices. Look at verse 18. I'll arise and go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. The son is very sorry. But do you notice something else about his expectations in his sorry speech? After all he's done, he's hoping that he might get employed as a hard servant in his father's household. But he doesn't expect he'll ever be loved again as a son. But just look at the welcome that he receives. Verse 20. And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, here comes the apology speech, it doesn't actually get fully finished. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe. Put it on him, put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet, bring the fattened calf, kill it, let us celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Isn't it incredible? As I say, the son can't even finish his well-rehearsed apology speech because his father's already rushed towards him and is embracing him. Maybe after the hug's over, he tries again to finish the full sentence, but once again he's interrupted. Father shouting directions everywhere with joy. Arrange the party, grab the best food, ring up the neighbours, invite everyone round. It's time to celebrate. Verse 24, for this my son was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and is found. The Father's love. See the Father's love, a stunning act of love on the Father's behalf. And remember, it's a story that Jesus is telling to tell some very religious people that they haven't understood God's love properly at all. This father in the story represents God. God loves rebels who had run away. True love is for those who don't deserve it. Now you can see, can't you, why Jesus is telling this story to the Pharisees and the scribes. The story continues actually all the way down to verse 32, where we're introduced to an older son who just doesn't get the father's love to the undeserving son. And he represents these grumbling Pharisees and scribes that Jesus is speaking to, people who cannot understand God's love, people who think that it needs to be earned. And Jesus is saying, no, if you're grumbling about me hanging out with sinners, the tax collectors who everyone hates, the prostitutes who everyone pities, it's because you haven't understood what God's love is like. He's the God who loves rebels who've run away. He loves it when rebels come returning to him. True love is for those who don't deserve it. And of course, we understand, don't we, why the Pharisees are so confused. We live in the sort of world that their minds would understand very well. A world where most of the time, love is a pretty transactional thing. I do this for you, you do this for me. I'll keep loving you as long as I get something back in return. I give love to you as long as it feels good to me. We live in a world where we can try really hard to be loved as well, can't we? Try really hard to earn acceptance. Much of our lives is based around the simple habit of working hard to get something we then deserve. The revision that makes the exam results go well, the crazy hours that make that promotion. And so, of course, that impacts how we think about love, how we think about our relationships. We're not used to the idea of doing nothing but being given everything. But God's love doesn't operate the way the world likes to work. True love is for those who don't deserve it. Let's go further. We're not used to the idea of doing nothing and being given everything. We certainly are not used to the idea of having done horrible things and still being given everything. We can be a very unforgiving people, can't we? And we can wrongly assume, again, that God is like us in this way. I was watching a drama series recently, very heavy, traumatic in places. It was a murder mystery. Horrible things in a small village were taking place. People were doing things they were very sorry for, that they were regretting. People making big mistakes. But somehow at the end, there was not complete and utter relational breakdown. There were reconciliations happening. And the director of the series said something really striking in a podcast that I was listening to recently, where he's kind of summing up everything that he'd been up to and why they decided to land the series the way they did. And he said this about the final episode. He said, we wanted to explore something different. We wanted to look at the concept of mercy and compassion and kindness. Those are all ideas that are very untrendy at the moment. And I thought, isn't that interesting that a director of a drama thought the concepts of mercy, compassion and kindness were just very unpopular at the moment. Our culture is a culture, isn't it, that is I think very unforgiving, and I wonder if it's just going to move further and further in that direction over the next few years. We're entering a time in life, well, we've entered a time in life, especially on social media, I think, and I don't reckon COVID's helped with this at all, where people are terrified of saying anything just in case they say the wrong thing. And the reason people are scared of saying the wrong thing is because they think what they say or what they've done or what they maybe did 20 years ago or said 20 years ago is going to take them beyond the point of ever being heard again, ever being listened to again, ever being loved again, even if they deeply regret it and are very, very sorry for it. Cancel culture, that is the move of the moment, isn't it? And I can understand the kind of intention of cancelling people in the you're finished, you're done, get out, never come back sort of way is meant to protect people. I wonder if actually it's just creating terror for everyone, because no one knows when they might drop off that cliff too and be cancelled as well, move beyond a point of ever being heard again, ever being listened to again, ever being loved again. We're not used to the idea, as I said earlier, of doing nothing and being given everything. We're certainly not used to the idea of doing horrible things and still being given everything. We can be very unforgiving indeed, but the incredible news from Jesus, the picture from these three stories, is that God isn't. Just look at the father when the rebel returns. As he's getting his apology speech out, he gives him a massive hug. True love is for those who don't deserve it. It's for rebels who've run away. And we see that fact most of all, not in these stories that Jesus is telling, but in a reality, something that happened in history at the heart of the Christian faith. God sent his precious son, Jesus Christ, to die for you and me, the rebels who've run away. We deserve to be punished eternally for rejecting the eternal one. We felt the wrongness in the story, didn't we, of the rejection of that son, turning from his father, wishing he was dead. But incredibly, despite the fact we have done that to God, he sent Jesus to rescue us, to die in our place, to die in the place of runaway rebels. We're all rebels who've run, and the challenge tonight, after seeing the heart of God, after seeing what true love looks like, who true love is for, is this: will we recognise that we need to return to him? Will we recognise, like this son, that we need to come back? If we haven't returned to God this evening, if we're still living a life without him, trying to go our own way, will we come back to him this evening? You might not have ever acknowledged him. You might have wished him dead. You might have done awful things. You may look at your life and say, I don't deserve this love. But wonderfully, that is precisely why you can come back to him. Because he is the God who shows true love. And true love is for those who don't deserve it.